Our next speaker is Joe Antos, my friend and colleague for many years, and I think I've introduced him here for 10 or 12 of those years. For those of you who've seen Joe speak before, no introduction is necessary. For those of you who haven't seen him speak before, to tell you that he is the Wilson H. Taylor Scholar in Healthcare and Retirement Policy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington is of no value to you. Joe has had a distinguished career at the Congressional Budget Office, at Health and Human Services, at the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And I think, Joe, I even cited you in my dissertation, so that's high praise. So welcome.
Well, I was going to thank Murray, but I'll thank Paul and Margaret for this conference, and I'll get to Murray later. It's a delight to be here, especially since between Jim and Keith, they basically have covered absolutely everything. I recommend that you, in particular, study Keith's slides. They're very good, and as he said, you know, not everybody's right, so study them carefully. Okay, so you know, like everybody else, you know, we had trouble with. You know, this is the Health Forecasting Conference 2016, but actually, you know, if we're forecasting anything, it's 2017 or maybe later. So, you know, you'll note that I have here. What I don't have here is repeal and replace, and this hits something that Keith just said. You know. Politicians will say words, but they are not found in the dictionary with the definitions that they actually have in mind. That's a good thing, because if they actually said, and there is one guy who might not be a politician who actually says words where you can find the words in the dictionary, and they do mean what he says, and that isn't so good, I think we've found. But anyway, so I was here last year, and I did speculate about a few things. And as I remember it, I think, you know, this, of course, is a conference that's held in late February. And so I think we were fairly close to legislation that turned out to be MACRA. I think I was probably skeptical last year. But, you know, surprise, surprise, Congress passed something. And then, of course, King v. Burwell, that was further down the road. And so I spent a lot of time talking about what could really happen. None of it happened. The Supreme Court sided with Burwell. However, it's not entirely clear to me that any of these problems were actually resolved. Maybe they were just deferred. In particular, in the case of the SGR fix, this struck me as a Republican embracing of the Pelosi principle that you have to pass it before you can understand it. And in this case, even after you pass it, you can't understand it. So, but I'll get to that. In any event, one thing did happen for sure. Hopes were dashed. But I'll get to him, too, in a second. Okay, so have the docs been fixed? And I mean that exactly how it seems. And I would say, yeah. So here's a little detail. I wouldn't spend too much time reading it right now, but you know, this idea of pushing physicians into alternative payment models. When Congress passed that law, they didn't know what an alternative payment model is. As Keith said, they're making it up as you go along. Generally, that's not the way you'd like to see Congress operate. You'd like them to have some idea what they're doing. What they did was they got out of the 21% cut that was scheduled for last year. But they could have done that without doing anything else. So I think the real question is, why did they do this? In particular, why did Republicans do this? Wendell probably has the answer to that. I don't understand it, other than that they thought that they were buying some credibility with physicians. You know, maybe they did because, of course, as somebody said, Jim said, nobody likes to read legislation. And so you only find out what it's doing to you once it finally starts to happen. As far as performance-based payment is concerned, it's an interesting phrase. This is clearly a phrase that is not in the dictionary, because it is not moving away from fee-for-service. All of the performance-based payment systems that we talk about are really various performance measures with some small percentage of payment attached to what is essentially a fee-for-service payment. Now, I have to say, I don't see any other way to do it. But we shouldn't confuse ourselves about what's going on there. And then the question, of course, is, well, so how do you measure performance? Because even if it's a small margin, that can be enough under some circumstances to get, in this case, physicians, but in general, the health sector to change the way it does things. What becomes critical is, what are those measures of performance? And I've got to say, that I'm not excited about having, a specialist in, brain cancer check to see whether I got a flu shot. I'm not so sure that's so relevant. And indeed, I think this is the fundamental problem with performance measures in the past, performance measures now, and performance measures in the future, which is to do it in a sense right, but it's impossible. You have to have performance measures that are lined up with not only what that specific physician, what that specialty does, but also what's involved with that patient. And that's really hard to do. In other words, what it calls for is an active physician who actually is paying attention to the patient and not maybe spending too much time with the laptop. Now, as far as pushing doctors into alternative payment models, whatever they may actually be, it is interesting. There is a bonus payment that is available if you are one of those holdouts who is in the unfavored fee-for-service system as opposed to the favored fee-for-service system. It's called MIPS. What is MIPS? Merit-based payment incentive system. But the interesting thing here is that the high performers can get a bonus, and it's taken right out of the pockets of the low performers. So it puts enormous financial pressure, kind of in the wrong way when you think about it. Do you want the low performers to escape the unfavored fee-for-service and go to the favored fee-for-service system? Because that's what's going to happen. Anyway, it's an interesting phenomenon, which I know darn well they didn't understand on the Hill, and I'm pretty sure they didn't really understand at HHS as well. But something like this will happen, of course, unless Congress does what it does best, which is change things when they feel the heat, and they will indeed feel the heat. Here's the past history of the sustainable growth rate, and what you could see is that for a very long time, we've seen updates, under 1%, largely under 1% once the SGR began to take hold. Well, that's precisely what MACRA does. It keeps the updates under 1%. So politically, has anything changed? No, we just changed the names, and we've made it sort of confusing. But I am confident that the medical establishment will figure this out. Okay, now, the ACA. Well, not quite out of the courts. Keith in particular mentioned House v. Burwell. And I have to say that, a lot depends on what you think that case is actually about. And I disagree with Keith's interpretation. I think it actually has to do with separation of powers. It does not have to do with some nefarious scheme to somehow destroy, maybe in some people's minds it would do this, but I don't think that's the fundamental issue. It's separation of powers. And indeed, this is a case that legal experts on the left seem to be universally astonished that the D.C. District Court would even consider the case. But of course, they weren't thinking about that policy, they were thinking about the constitutional policy. That judge was thinking about the constitutional policy. So it is a relevant case. But it isn't going to be decided until possibly sometime next year, and depending on how it goes, maybe it'll go to the Supreme Court. This could drag on for a long, long time. So the idea that this is an immediate threat to the ACA, I think, is wrong. But is it a case that brings up the fundamental problem that I think constitutional scholars have with the Obama administration, which has to do with overstepping the legal bounds of executive authority? Yeah, I think it's fundamental. Okay, so anyway, ACA, of course, it's not out of the woods. We've seen the recent enrollment numbers. Actually, the 12.6 has now become 12.7 mysteriously between HHS press releases over the course of, I think, 1 or 2 days. Murray's already threatening me. I will try to ignore that, Murray. So, HHS now says that the exchanges have enrolled 12.7 million people. I think the thing to look at, when you look at the red bars, look at the increases in enrollment in the exchanges over these last several years. And you could see, not surprisingly, I mean, if you start with a 0 here for 2013, you could argue, it jumped from 0 to 8. But of course, that's not right, because a lot of those people already had individual coverage. So and there's a big debate about how many people really gained new coverage. So I'll stay away from that. But look at 14 to 15, 15 to 16. What do you see? From 14 to 15, there was a 3.7 million increase in exchange enrollment. From 15 to 16, so far, it's about 1 million. And according to Charles Gaba, a guy who supports the ACA, many people believe in his numbers. Okay, I think he's on the high side, but he thinks that it could be potentially as many as 2.2 million added this year compared to last year. Well, that's less than 3.7 million, isn't it? It's tapering off, and there's a reason why it's tapering off. It has to do with the nature of what's available in the exchanges and the nature of the subsidies. It's not a surprise that people who are heavily subsidized will give exchange coverage a second thought, a second glance, but they won't necessarily buy it, especially if they're young and typically male and invincible, because it's still pretty expensive. And as John Gable pointed out, the deductibles are pretty high. So what is the value of that to someone who wants to get, because this is what they thought they were going to get, wants to get the routine office visits covered, or the sick child visit? So there's a real problem there. There's a cost problem, but there's also a value problem in that coverage. Now, I did show the CBO projections. And these are from 2010 because I needed to get 2014, 2015, 2016. But I did this not to make a point about what a great disappointment the ACA is. It is a great disappointment, but not because of anything CBO ever said. I did this because not just in 2010, but in 2015, CBO thought that this round, the current round, there would be 21 million people enrolled in the exchanges. And a few weeks ago, they lowered their estimate substantially, which is good news. It shows that economists, given an overwhelming amount of information, will eventually see what everybody else knows. I say that as a proud graduate of the CBO and as an economist. So, take my comments for what they're worth. And it also says that, that mandate really didn't really work. And why didn't it really work? Well, the mandate penalty, again, the people who really support the ACA and believe in all the provisions kind of miss the point that real people either are totally unaware of the penalty because they don't know anybody who's ever been penalized, or if they know anything about it, then they look at it, they see the number, and then they look at what it's going to cost them to buy coverage that they don't think is worth much to them, and they draw what is often the human conclusion. So, does the ACA have a long way to go? Yeah, but it has a long way to go in directions that you can't get there from here. You can't get there from the ACA, at least not very easily, and not with somebody who wants to simply build on it. You have to do more than that. Okay, now, what about this deal with United Healthcare saying that they're losing money and they might not participate next time? And by the way, when is next time? Next time is not this year, it's next year. So it's interesting when you look at United's end-of-year report. What do you see? So their ACA business, very small compared to their company-wide business. 650,000 covered lives. They managed to lose $475 million. I'd say that's an accomplishment. Whereas the rest of their business, obviously they did very well. More than 46 million covered lives. They netted $5.8 billion. So, what's going on here? And then, by the way, the threat isn't idle. In January, United said that they're going to stop paying commissions for ACA enrollments. So that's a pretty good indication that they're not interested in this market anymore. And by the way, those numbers are a pretty good indication that it's a bad business deal for them. Now, Peter Lee from Covered California was very critical of United. This is a quote from an interview. You can see what it says. He says, they basically didn't want to admit that they screwed up. And according to him, it was giving an excuse to Wall Street and throwing the Affordable Care Act under the bus. That's very interesting. However, all the other major insurers had the same problem. Many of them had more positive-sounding press releases. Oh, yeah, we're very optimistic. But nonetheless, they all had the same problem. And why is that? Well, there are lots of reasons. I'll get to it in just a second. But the reality is that the big companies really had difficulty because this is a new market for them. What about co-ops? Are they also pawns of Wall Street? I'll bet Bernie Sanders would be surprised at that. No, they're not pawns of Wall Street. They don't know how to run insurance businesses. It is not surprising that more than half of them have collapsed by now. And, just a matter of time before all of them go. Even Andy Slavitt, who is the CMS administrator, said last week or 2 weeks ago that they're going to aggressively try to recoup $1.2 billion, which is far less than what they gave the co-ops to get started. So, yeah, they didn't know what they were doing. And in some sense, the big companies didn't really know what they were getting into. So what is the future then for the ACA, at least the exchange business? Well, you can see who's lowering their presence in that market, and you can see who's raising their presence in the market, and it's not a coincidence. Companies like Molina and Centene are in the Medicaid managed care business, and they have a huge advantage because what are the exchanges? It's sort of the graduate program for Medicaid. And not only that, but they already know who the customers are because they've got them now. So this is where we're headed. The exchange part of this business is probably never going to be able to pull itself out without the kinds of reforms that I don't see Democrats being willing to tolerate. Okay, so let's move on to politics. Meet the new boss. Same as the old boss? We won't get fooled again. Well, get on your knees and pray. So what about the Ryan era? It's been very interesting. It pays not to say anything if you're a politician, which is the hallmark of Republican presidential candidates. On the eve of the House approving John Boehner's two-year budget bill, Paul Ryan says, this process stinks. This is not the way to conduct the people's business. And he went on to say that when he's in charge, we're gonna do regular order. Well, okay. The reality is the regular order is hard to live with in the House, and it can cause difficulties. However, he did say something very interesting. His first major speech as Speaker, he said, in part, next year we are going to unveil a plan to replace every word of Obamacare. Now, I have to disagree with Keith. The task forces are not worthless. This is not a worthless exercise. This is a very important exercise. The reason is that, depending on who the candidate is, you might want to nudge them in the direction of, let's say, dare I say, mainstream thinking. And so it's not a bad idea to get out there. Normally, I'd say in the presidential election year, you wouldn't do this. But I think this year's a pretty good year to do it. Anyway, so then the 12th, which is what, last week, Paul Ryan says that the House may not pass a budget resolution this year. Why is that? Basically, you get all wound up in all sorts of problems if you have a budget resolution, and it's not with Democrats, it's with Republicans. And then, now that Justice Scalia has passed on, this, I think, throws the entire regular order budget process completely out the window. We're going to see okay, so let me get to the end of this. I blew this up as much as I could because I wanted you to know that we in Washington have known for more than a year that Trump was coming in 2016. Now, for us, that's it. But much to our surprise, there are a few other candidates. And what do they say? Well, Ted Cruz, of course, probably the most important statement he's made so far. You know who one of those millions of Americans who lost their health care because of Obamacare? That would be me. Now, obviously, he was trying to get the sympathy vote, and he needs it. But what else do they say? Well, okay, so, the Donald says what everybody says. It's a disaster. We're going to repeal and replace it. Marco Rubio mentions advanceable refundable tax credits, reforming regulations, and so on. Ted Cruz talks about, this is actually out of the very, very old Republican playbook, buying insurance across state lines, expanding health savings accounts. These are the kinds of standard things that Republicans have been talking about, I think, for decades. Jeb Bush talks about innovation, so Jim actually has a better summary than that. And then Donald Trump. You didn't emphasize Donald's big plans. He wants a comprehensive health care program funded by an increase in corporate taxes. And he did say this during the campaign. This is a direct quote. That is an interesting Republican statement. And then, of course, he wants to well, he says, if we competitively bid drugs in the U.S., this has been interpreted, this is a direct quote from him, this has been interpreted as negotiating, but he said competitively bid. In any event, he didn't mean $300 billion a year. We don't spend that much on drugs. Okay, so what are the principles of reform? Who knows? Depending on who's elected, maybe we will. I don't have to go over this, but I think a key thing, which again I think Keith said, is you have to start from where you are, not from where you are not, and not from where you never were, which is a very important thing. Now, I have to say something about the warmth between the Democratic candidates. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, not Benjamin Franklin, not Thomas Edison, Ralph Waldo Emerson said this, moderation in all things, especially moderation. Maybe not. But Medicare for all, Sanders' plan would break the bank. I won't go over the details here, but the reality is that it didn't, something like Sanders' plan, a single-payer plan, hasn't worked in Vermont, or New Hampshire. Is it Vermont or New Hampshire? Vermont. And it'll work just as well for the country. What about Hillary's plan? It is kind of back to the future. As she said, it was called Hillary Care before. It was called Obamacare. Again, the question is she really capable of making the kinds of changes that would, for the progressives of the party, make, let's call it Obamacare 2, more palatable and get more people signed up for government health care. I think that remains to be seen. Now, I'm not sure who's going to be president, but there's one in particular who I'm very excited about.